Imagine you're at a lecture on ancient philosophy. The speaker is describing the Buddhist teachings on impermanence, the intricate logic of suffering and its cessation. It's abstract, profound, almost mathematical in its elegance. You nod along, appreciating the intellectual architecture. Then you walk outside and see a devotee fervently rubbing the belly of a golden statue for good luck, or lighting a specific colored candle to ensure a prosperous week. The connection between the two scenes feels distant, almost contradictory. This gap between the founder's sophisticated philosophy and the believer's tangible ritual isn't an accident or a corruption, it's the inevitable result of a fundamental transformation. The core argument of a provocative article I recently read pushes this even further. It claims figures like Buddha or Jesus were, at their heart, pure philosophers. Their profound, abstract systems weren't meant to be worshipped but understood. Yet everywhere we look, their teachings have become populated with saints, relics, and rituals that would seem utterly foreign to their original propositions. So what happened? How does a rigorous philosophy of emptiness or divine love morph into a practice of seeking blessings from a statue or collecting sacred objects? The article suggests this shift is not a betrayal, but a necessary adaptation, a kind of philosophical dilution required for mass survival. It's a compelling, clean, and fiercely rational explanation, but it rests on one sweeping, almost surgical redefinition, stripping these founders of any sacred aura and recasting them solely as thinkers. And that single secular premise changes everything. So that really sets our table beautifully for this deep dive. Our mission today is to really explore this transformation, this move from abstract doctrine to materialized faith. We're going to dig into the cognitive reasons, that sort of primal human need that makes us prefer something we can touch over a big idea. We'll also track the historical forces that made this shift not just likely, but necessary. And then we'll see how this whole process almost inevitably creates this massive socioeconomic engine. We're talking wealth, power, and really specific kinds of commerce that are still shaping our world.
That tension you laid out it's just the defining feature of any religious system that lasts. You framed it perfectly. It's not corruption, it's the engine of survival. Historically, any system, especially one that brings in this idea of transcendence, a higher, superior reality, it has to find a way to make that huge idea make sense. It needs to be emotionally engaging, something you can actually do.
So it needs a translation.
A translation, exactly. A physical or procedural one that can root these massive concepts in daily life, in memory. Especially if you want it to spread across huge, diverse populations.
Let's unpack that. I think a good place to start is the historical moment where this gap first really started to widen. I'm thinking about the rise of what are called historic religions back in the first millennium BCE, systems like ancient Israel, early Buddhism, and then later, of course, Christianity. The key innovation there, the thing that really changed everything, was this idea of symbolic dualism.
Right. This assertion of a higher spiritual transcendent realm.
Something fundamentally superior to our messy, mortal, earthly world.
And that was a genuine historical watershed. I mean, a total game changer.
Yeah.
Before this, most religious systems were deeply integrated with the world around them.
They were practical.
Very practical. Focused on managing the natural world, the political world, a good harvest, winning a battle, that sort of thing.
But this transcendent push, this new dualism, it just dramatically changed the focus.
Completely. The number one religious goal shifted. It wasn't about securing a good life here, but achieving salvation.
Transcending this earthly plane entirely.
And that move, which seems purely spiritual, actually had immense organizational and political leverage.
How so?
Well, these systems suddenly had a kind of legitimacy that was separate from the local king or emperor. It was autonomous.
So if the emperor is just part of the messy earthly realm.
Exactly. The religious system now has a place to stand, a fulcrum point from which it can judge and even try to reform the political world.
That's fascinating. So the move toward the abstract and the spiritual paradoxically gives the system the most leverage it's ever had in the material world.
Precisely. But this focus on the transcendent, it created intellectual problems almost right away.
Especially in the traditions that got a heavy dose of Greek philosophy.
Yes, that's where you see the tension become acute.
Yeah.
Later religious philosophers, especially in Judaism and Christianity after the Hellenistic period, they start applying these Greek concepts to their own scriptures.
You mean things like Neoplatonist or Aristotelian logic?
That's it. And this application is what creates theological doctrine. It's an attempt to formalize belief, To define the divine in these very strict, abstract terms, it strips away all the poetry.
I'm thinking of the classic example here, Saint Anselm of Canterbury. This is what, 11th century?
Right.
And he defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, which is?
It's a perfect crystallization of that philosophical distance. You move from a concrete image, like a divine warrior or a loving parent, to what sounds like a math problem.
A logical premise. The most perfect being.
And if you contrast that with the original language of, say, the Hebrew Bible or the Rabbinic Haggadah, the storytelling parts of the Talmud, it's strikingly and deliberately anthropomorphic.
The biblical God is a character, almost.
Absolutely. A full-blown character. God is described with human attitudes, thoughts, even what we'd call vulnerabilities.
Right. He's loving, he gets angry, he weeps for his children.
Has hands and feet. The language is immediate. It's impressionistic. It's all about relationship. It's a God who gets involved, not some distant, perfect concept.
And this contrast, it has profound effects on how the system deals with big problems, like the classic problem of evil.
Oh, a huge effect.
Because that abstract, perfect God, the one who's all-knowing, all-powerful, morally flawless, that's the God that the philosophical argument from evil is built to disprove.
Exactly. The argument is that the classical problem of evil, why does a good, all-powerful God allow suffering, is really an artifact. It's a philosophical burden that was introduced by applying these Greek concepts.
So it wasn't a problem in the original conception?
Not in the same way. The original, robustly anthropomorphic God of the Hebrew Bible is a God whose love involves vulnerability, maybe even limitations.
What do you mean by limitations?
Well, if God weeps for his children or regrets creating humanity, that implies a capacity for suffering. It suggests that maybe in that moment, his power to just unilaterally fix an injustice isn't the whole story. The relationship is more complex.
So instead of being a flaw in the original religious idea, the problem of evil is actually an intellectual puzzle created by an academic innovation.
A Neoplatonic attempt to define God based on these perfect, unchanging attributes.
The God of abstract doctrine is just too perfect to argue with.
Right, but the God of these impressionistic images, who's complex and sometimes vulnerable, that's a God who invites argument, contestation.
You're thinking of Abraham.
Think of Abraham arguing with God about destroying Sodom. He says, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" He's not questioning a philosophical principle. He's ethically challenging the actions of a relational figure.
So that philosophical insistence on perfection, it closes that door. It demands theoretical coherence over lived, messy, relational experience.
The anthropomorphic model allows for that ethical negotiation. It's built for it.
So the second theology gets its hands on these Greek concepts. It gains a kind of intellectual sophistication, but it loses that relational richness. And in the process, it creates brand new theoretical problems that were never there to begin with. Which brings us to a really crucial point about how these systems actually work for people. It's about the power of poetic imagery, of having multiple ways to see things over one unified doctrine.
Yes.
So this imagery, God as a bridegroom, God as a woman in labor, God as vengeful, it's not just, surface decoration. It's essential.
It is the engine of emotional engagement. These contrasting images, they function as multiple essential profiles of the divine. And religious life is just so much richer because there were so many of them.
They're like a toolkit.
A comprehensive toolkit of emotional and ethical resources. The impartial judge profile is what you need when you're seeking justice or looking at your own moral failures. The nurturing, weeping parent profile is what's salient when you need comfort, when you feel abandoned.
But these profiles, they're often contradictory. A perfect, abstract being can't be both a vengeful patriarch and a nurturing mother at the same time. Logically, they clash.
And that striking dissonance, that willingness to just live with a lack of conceptual coherence, that is precisely the point.
The goal isn't a perfect theory.
The goal in this original poetic anthropomorphic mode is not theoretical agreement. It's not doctrine. It's practical ability. It's kind of knowing how.
Knowing how to navigate what life throws at you.
Exactly. How to navigate complex, confusing, contradictory human experiences using the right image, the right story. It's about developing a feel for how to proceed. Even when the big philosophical ideas aren't all neatly defined, it's a pragmatic theology.
So if you're facing a moral crisis, you appeal to the judge. If you're in despair, you appeal to the parent. You use the profile that fits the situation.
That's it. And this changes what it even means to be an adherent. When you look at the ancient literature, being part of the religion is less about holding abstract beliefs.
what's called the propositional content model.
Right. It's much more about effective experience. It's about standing in awe of the Lord, Yer Hashem in Hebrew, rather than just being a believer, or mu'min in the early language of Islam.
Can we just pause there? Because that contrast between awe, Yer Hashem, and propositional belief, mu'min, feels critical to this whole shift toward the tangible.
It's absolutely central. When you talk about Yer Hashem, you're talking about a state of profound, often overwhelming emotional and sensory response. It's a reaction to the perceived power of the divine.
It's an
experiential state. It's recognizing the vast gap between your own finitude and divine majesty, often mixed with a sense of love or duty. It makes you want to act, to be obedient, but it doesn't necessarily require you to tick a box and assent to a list of abstract claims.
It's something you feel and you do.
Exactly. Whereas when the emphasis shifts to holding a specific belief or a proposition, which is what happened when philosophy got injected into theology, adherence becomes an intellectual exercise.
A matter of assent.
Right. And that propositional content is easier to formalize, easier to turn into law, and ultimately easier for the abstract philosopher to control. But it risks stripping away the deep, personal, affective resonance.
The relationship.
The relationship with that anthropomorphic, impressionistic deity. The move to abstract doctrine was, intellectually sophisticated, but it paradoxically threw out the very elements, the poetic and the anthropomorphic, that made the divine relatable and actionable for most people. It introduced a theoretical purity that human nature itself was basically destined to reject.
Which leads us straight into the deep wiring of the human brain. If these abstract doctrines were so pure, so intellectually superior, why are they always, and I mean consistently, replaced or at least supplemented by simple, tangible rituals, by statues? Why does the complex theologian always seem to be chasing after the golden statue?
Because the theologian is fighting a losing battle against our fundamental cognitive architecture. We are, you might say, evolutionarily predisposed toward anthropomorphism.
We see human-like agency everywhere.
We can't help it. Our survival for millennia has depended on interpreting complex, unpredictable forces, predators, rivals, even the weather, by inferring mental states, agency, intentionality. We default to assuming a mind is behind things.
So when you're faced with the sheer scale and abstraction of the transcendent,
your brain naturally applies that same agency filter. The transcendent becomes a person. A king, a judge, a parent.
And this is where the cognitive science of religion really comes in. I'm thinking of the concept of minimal counterintuitiveness.
Absolutely essential. For any concept, religious or not, to be culturally memorable, to be successfully passed down through generations, and to scale across a huge population, it needs to be minimally counterintuitive, or MCI.
Okay, break that down.
It means it has to be close enough to the concepts we already know, like human minds, bodies, intentions, to be easily understood. That's the intuitive part. But it also has to be just different enough, counterintuitive enough to feel extraordinary, special, worth remembering and talking about.
So a divine figure who weeps for his people, that's an intuitive human emotion, but he can also create a universe in an instant that's a highly counterintuitive power. The combination is what makes it sticky.
Precisely. It's memorable, it's catchy, pure abstraction, like St. Anselm's concept of infinite, undifferentiated perfection is just too counterintuitive. It requires immense philosophical training and constant effort to even hold in your mind. It's cognitively demanding and emotionally cold.
It's just so much easier for our brains to relate to a divine figure with a clear personality and human-like feelings.
Infinitely easier. So the shift toward tangible personified forms isn't some failure of piety. It's a necessary cognitive adaptation. It's what's required for the system's cultural transmission and its very survival.
So the gold statues, the relics, the paintings, the rituals, they're actually the most efficient way to embed the theology into the collective memory of a large non-specialist population.
Yes. They're cognitive shortcuts to the transcendent.
They're anchors.
They are the anchors. The objects themselves, a statue, a prayer bead, a specific building, they help focus memory, emotion, and theological meaning into a sensory experience. And when you frame them through ritual, by veiling an object or restricting access to it or making it out of gold, you're performing this process of making special.
And that process ensures the big idea, no matter how philosophically complex, becomes something you can perceive, remember, and act on.
And this whole necessity is compounded by the adaptive functions of rituals themselves. These concrete practices are not just, footnotes to the theology. They're psychologically and sociologically vital for groups.
Rituals are powerful tools.
They're one of our oldest forms of social technology. They are psychologically prepared, culturally inherited behaviors that serve these critical functions for social groups. We rely on them instinctively to coordinate and manage uncertainty.
The psychological payoff for the individual must be huge, especially when things feel chaotic or unpredictable.
Massive. Rituals are excellent for managing anxiety. They give you a fixed, predictable script of action in a world that feels out of control. And that gives individuals and the whole group a powerful sense of agency.
And socially?
Socially, they're crucial. Performing shared, synchronized rituals reinforces commitment to the group's norms. It promotes deep trust, especially if the ritual's costly or painful. And it facilitates cooperation. All things you absolutely need for a group to survive.
Let's look at a really concrete procedural example because there's one that illustrates this beautifully. That specific, highly detailed ritual for finding a romantic partner.
Ah, yes, that example is so striking because it just highlights this psychological need for detail over efficacy.
So the ritual is, buy a new sharp knife and stick it 4 times into a banana tree on June 12th at midnight. The goal is to find a suitable partner.
It's practiced in parts of rural India, and what's fascinating is just how rigid it is. Why 4 times? Why banana tree? Why midnight on June 12th? The actual mechanism is completely opaque.
Right. If you did it at 12:05 a.m., you might feel like you failed, even though rationally, a 5-minute delay shouldn't have any impact on your romantic destiny.
Exactly. That seemingly absurd level of procedural detail is precisely what makes the ritual so potent and so culturally transmissible. People stick to these steps because of an intuitive belief in a specific causal link, even if that link makes no logical or scientific sense.
So the high-fidelity transmission, the insistence on doing it exactly right, is the key.
It provides a cognitive structure for addressing these outcomes that are critical for our fitness, like finding a mate. The process is preserved because the complexity itself signals that this is serious, that this is powerful. It doesn't matter if the banana tree actually cares.
So, the shift to tangible, highly detailed ritual, rubbing a statue for luck, sticking a knife in a specific place at a specific time, that's the necessary, inevitable path for this philosophical dilution. It takes these profound but abstract systems of suffering or impermanence or divine love, and it transforms them into something accessible, memorable, and immediately actionable for the masses.
It's not a dumbing down.
No, it's the engine that ensures the profound system actually lives on beyond the academy, beyond the monastery. To really appreciate how sophisticated this shift from abstract to material can be, we need to look at an artifact that deliberately embodies this tension. I'm talking about the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes.
This is a material object that is mediating between a physical representation and aniconism. It's an object dedicated basically to the presence of absence.
The Ark, as it's described, is just a masterpiece of material theology. It's designed to communicate transcendence using a tangible form.
Let's talk about the construction.
Well, it was made of acacia wood, which is known for its durability, and then rigorously overlaid with gold. Gold signifies royal status, purity, and it was crowned by the mercy seat, the hilasterion in Greek, and flanked by 2 cherubim made of hammered gold.
And these cherubim, they were complex winged figures, not human-like.
No, and they visually mark the Ark as the divine throne on earth.
And the cherubim themselves are highly stylized. They're borrowing heavily from common Near Eastern iconography. You see parallels with Mesopotamian lamassu and throne guardians from Egyptian and Canaanite art.
The borrowing is intentional. It grounds the artifact in a cultural language people would have understood. But the key divergence, the absolute central design element, is that the space between the cherubim is intentionally left empty.
The void.
That void, that radical absence of an image, is the focal point of theophany, of the manifestation of God. The Ark functions as a throne, but it's a vacant one.
So it makes God present through the disciplined use of space and boundary.
And it asserts God's utter unrepresentability, not by rejecting art entirely, but by strategically using its absence. Aniconism here is not a lack of art. It's a sophisticated, deliberate visual strategy.
The sources also highlight how the Ark's power wasn't just there. It was generated through this meticulous choreography of sensory and cognitive cues, a systematic process of making special.
Right, involving sight, touch restriction, and crucially, smell.
The visual paradox is amazing. The Ark was visibly magnificent, gilded, radiant, symbolizing immense value.
Yet it was perpetually hidden.
Right. veiled by leather and cloth, housed in total darkness inside the Holy of Holies, and only accessible to the high priest, and only at certain times.
And that visual exclusion just intensified its spiritual gravity. It turned the act of seeing it into a highly restricted, ritualized event.
And the touch restriction emphasized this theology of distance even more.
Yes, the design itself, with the gold rings and the carrying poles, it ensured that it could be moved by the Levites without any direct human contact.
It encodes a theology of untouchability.
And profound reverence. It prevents the object from being cheapened by casual contact. It ensures the gap between the sacred and the profane stays absolute. The material structure, the wood, the gold, the poles, literally enforce theological doctrine.
And then there's smell. I honestly rarely think of smell as being theological, but it's given immense weight here.
Smell was absolutely critical. The use of elaborate, expensive incense and the smoke of sacrifice, often described as a pleasing aroma to the Lord, it transformed the sense of smell into a language.
A language of divine acceptance, atonement.
Communion. Since you couldn't see the divine form, the divine presence was made perceptible through other senses. Smell became a sacred signature. When that smoke rose and filled the sacred space, it provided an immediate, visceral, emotional confirmation of God's proximity. It just intensified the spiritual gravity of the space around that imageless throne.
The restraint is just incredible, and the contents of the ark reinforce this commitment to an imageless covenant. It wasn't a picture of God.
No, it was tangible reminders of God's actions. The tablets of the law, Aaron's rod that budded, the jar of manna.
So the ark functions as this supreme cognitive anchor for the collective memory and theological identity of Israel.
It embodies covenant, presence, and holiness in a way that was profoundly perceptible, yet utterly imageless.
And it was also an active agent.
Yes, its mobility in the wilderness and in military campaigns visualized Yahweh's guidance. It showed God as actively involved in history. The physical mobility of the divine throne was a theological statement in motion.
But this material anchor, it faced the ultimate test of any material object. The ark eventually disappeared, probably during the Babylonian exile. So how did the system cope with losing its central physical object?
That physical disappearance was pivotal. But because the ark's power was rooted in absence and memory rather than a physical image, its impact actually endured.
Its absence accelerated a change.
A reorientation of the religious imagination. The ark transitioned from being a physical object of worship to becoming an even more powerful memory anchor. It was sustained in texts, in liturgy, in the collective story.
It became a metaphor
For interiorized faith, the idea of the Torah as a spiritual sanctuary or the human heart as the new Holy of Holies. The human mind's innate ability to fill absence with narrative is what allows the ark's mystery to achieve this enduring theological impact. It proves that once materialization successfully anchors a concept, the object itself can be lost, and the faith can still thrive.
So we've established that this move from abstract philosophy to materialized faith satisfies a profound cognitive and psychological need. But it does something else that is absolutely massive. It generates sophisticated, complex economic systems. Let's transition now to the marketplace of the sacred. A great place to start is the medieval European trade in Christian saints' relics. Here, that tension between the pure spiritual sacred and the ruthless economic transaction was just acutely visible.
The relic trade, which really peaked between 800 and 1200, is one of the clearest historical examples of the sacred becoming a highly sought-after commodity.
So we're talking about physical fragments of holy people.
Yes, and they were systematically acquired, transported, bought, and sold for immense profit by monastic orders, bishops, specialized merchants, all across these vast, complex trading networks in Western Europe.
They were a physical point of contact for the transcendent.
The pilgrims, yes. That's what they provided.
So these fragments of bone or hair or clothing, they weren't just spiritual objects, they were assets in a pre-modern economy.
Absolutely. But unlike grain or iron, their value wasn't standardized by weight or volume.
So what determined their value?
Their utility. Specifically, their perceived ability to perform miracles, their virtues. A relic's value would soar if it was linked to successful healings, or vanquishing enemies, or protection from disease.
But they were also tools for acquiring secular power.
Critically so. When a community, let's say the powerful cathedral in Durham, acquired the extremely valuable relics of St. Cuthbert, they immediately increased the prestige of that site.
And they would market it.
They would promote it through elaborate public displays, moving the fragments into these sumptuous, highly decorated reliquaries. They're essentially marketing the asset. And this brought floods of pilgrims and donations, which rapidly increased the church's land holdings and political influence.
That sounds surprisingly modern, like an institution investing in a high-value, unique asset that generates continuous revenue streams based on its prestige.
It is a stunning precursor to modern commerce. And what's more, relics functioned as inalienable commodities.
What does that mean?
It means that while they could be traded, their true maximal economic and spiritual value was only realized in a specific location where their cult was already established and promoted.
So if you stole St. Cuthbert's remains and moved them to some tiny, obscure church,
their capacity to draw pilgrims and donations, their spiritual and economic utility, would be significantly diminished. They became inseparable from the geographical and social identity of their host community. So they conferred a power that went way beyond just pure monetary value. Studying this trade gives us this invaluable insight into how pre-modern markets worked, driven not just by cash, but by objects that conferred spiritual, political, and material power all at once.
And this inherent connection between the sacred and the market, it didn't just stop in the medieval period. It seems fundamental to the structure of pilgrimage itself.
Absolutely. Pilgrimage, once it gets organized, is an economic activity that often creates the very infrastructure that markets need.
I'm thinking of the work by Victor and Edith Turner.
Their seminal works speculated that the whole apparatus of medieval European pilgrimage, the established routes, the markets that popped up around shrines, the hospices, the legal devices to protect pilgrims, that all this may have provided the direct antecedents for modern contractual relationships.
Even the foundational elements of Western capitalism, that's a huge claim.
It's a huge claim. The idea is that communitas, that temporary egalitarian feeling of fellowship among diverse strangers on the road, laid the psychological groundwork for voluntary contractual exchange outside of the fixed feudal status relationships. It fostered a sense of voluntarism.
But not everyone agrees with that.
No. Many scholars push back, arguing that this Turneresque view kind of romanticizes pilgrimage. It sets it apart as this sacred realm and discourages analysis of the very real economic machinery that supports it.
So we really need to adopt more of a political economy approach here.
Exactly. We have to recognize that pilgrimage is never separate from commerce. It's subject to varied, intense forms of control by national churches, commercial enterprises, and increasingly governments.
And we see this today, right?
All over the place. Look at the rise of global religious movements. The massive global expansion of prosperity-oriented Pentecostalism, for instance, adapts perfectly to neoliberal ideologies and global labor mobility. It's a form of Christianity that lends spiritual reinforcement to moving for a job, to entrepreneurial ambition, to career aspiration. The powerful interweaving of capitalism and religion isn't just historical, it's entirely contemporary.
And if we want to see sacred wealth operating on a national, even global scale today, we just need to look at contemporary Asia. The sources go into detail on how Indian temples function as these massive socioeconomic institutions.
Indian temples, especially major sites like Tirupati or the Padmanabhaswamy Temple, they are financial titans. They accumulate literal billions in wealth in gold, silver, cash, donations, massive land holdings.
And this sacred wealth acts like a constant flow of economic capital.
It generates massive employment, it drives local economic growth in what are called temple towns. And this wealth is managed by complex temple trusts, religious boards, and frequently state-appointed administrative bodies just because of the sheer scale of the assets involved.
This accumulation of wealth, it must generate a deep sociological contradiction. These temples are supposed to promote universal solidarity, but they seem to reinforce stratification.
They do both at the same time. On one hand, they foster Durkheim's idea of social solidarity. You have shared festivals, rituals, communal feeding.
But on the other hand,
the economic and ritual infrastructure needed to manage all this wealth is deeply intertwined with traditional caste hierarchies. Wealth accumulation and managerial authority often reinforce traditional dominance.
So you'll have Brahmins in positions of ritual authority.
And lower castes are typically relegated to service-based, labor-intensive roles. Cleaning, sanitation, specific manual labor within the complex. So sacred wealth is not this harmonious spiritual reserve. It is a highly contested site, which leads to intense political demands for transparency, for legal oversight, and for structural reforms to address the systemic inequality.
And in other Asian contexts, the market integration is so complete that the marketplace essentially is the new ritual.
Ian Reader's work on Japanese pilgrimage is the perfect illustration of this. Shrine administrators operate a lot like CEOs. They're deeply concerned with market share, attracting enough pilgrims to sustain these colossal maintenance costs.
So the pilgrimage itself is partly constituted by commercialism.
The sacred space expands beyond the shrine to include the shops, the tourist offices, the specialty food vendors, the transportation systems, the language they use, the marketing, the overall operation. It's just as entrepreneurial as it is pious. It shows that in this model, the economic engine of faith isn't incidental or separate. It is integral to maintaining and popularizing the entire sacred system. The move from abstraction to materiality has created a system that is ruthlessly efficient at generating capital.
That brings us to our final economic observation, which connects the materialization of faith directly to the contemporary consumer world, the global decoupling of value from brand. This is fascinating because it suggests a kind of secular modern materialism that mirrors the theological shift we've been tracking.
It absolutely mirrors that process of moving value from a distant, abstract concept, the doctrine or the brand name, to the tangible, observable use value of the ritual or the product quality.
And China's manufacturing dominance is the key accelerator here.
It's the key accelerator of this global phenomenon. We've seen a shift from obvious low-quality fakes to this sophisticated, high-quality dupe culture. The physical quality of a product is just increasingly indistinguishable between the luxury original and its well-made alternative.
Why does this decoupling matter so much to our discussion?
Because the manufacturing capability, the sheer quality of the materialization process, is becoming visible and accessible to everyone. In the past, the only way to signal high quality was through the massive marketing and exclusivity of a luxury brand.
But
Now we see consumers intentionally buying a no-logo dupe because they know that the manufacturer in, say, Shenzhen makes the components or even the entire product for the leading luxury brand. For that educated consumer, the absence of the brand logo, this act of debranding, becomes a status symbol in itself.
that is a huge philosophical shift in consumer behavior. It signals that the buyer is sophisticated enough to extract the pure use value of the product without paying that enormous brand tax.
It shifts where the prestige comes from. The prestige lies not in adhering to the brand's story, but in the ruthless, rational calculation of utility and quality. And this is also fueled by Shanzhai innovation.
A term that used to just mean copying.
Right, but now it refers to this rapid, iterative, hyper-competitive product development.
Can you elaborate on that innovation aspect of Shanzhai?
Well, it often starts as a response to perceived failures or limitations in global branded products. There's an example of a Shenzhen startup that initially copied existing drone technology. They realized that in the local, intensely hot climate, the copied cooling systems were failing constantly.
A problem the global brands hadn't focused on.
Right, because it wasn't a problem in their main markets. So the startup didn't just keep copying, they rapidly engineered a unique, heat-resistant cooling system. The imitation, using this rapid prototyping approach, quickly morphs into a unique, hyper-competitive product that eventually sets a new industry standard.
So China's manufacturing knowledge and speed means that technical quality is becoming the default expectation.
Regardless of the brand's origin or its marketing narrative.
So whether we're talking about an imageless ark embodying a covenant or a no-logo dupe bag embodying superior craftsmanship, the economic endgame of materialization is the same.
The abstract, distant brand narrative loses its monopoly on value when the craftsmanship, the quality, the sheer use value become visible and accessible. This rational, ruthless economic calculation is spreading globally, and it's fundamentally changing how we perceive and transmit value. So, to synthesize the expansive terrain we've covered, I think the central truth is this. The profound, abstract philosophies of the founders, whether we're talking doctrines of emptiness, perfect love, or transcendental existence, they inherently require translation. They have to be adapted into material, anthropomorphic, and ritualistic forms. And that's because of our deep human cognitive wiring, our evolved preference for the concrete and the minimally counterintuitive, and just the pragmatic necessities of cultural transmission and massive social cohesion.
And this adaptation, which, a purist might dismissively label as dilution or even a philosophical betrayal, is revealed to be the true engine of survival, of perpetuity. From the imageless but fiercely material Ark of the Covenant, to the massive economic architecture built on the medieval relic trade, to the stratified wealth of contemporary Indian temples. This materialization of faith and philosophy always generates these parallel systems of immense, complex, and politically contested economic power.
The sacred object, whether it's a relic or a statue, is rarely just sacred. It's a powerful cognitive anchor, it's a marker of indispensable group identity, and it's a generator of political capital and financial control. It seamlessly links the highest metaphysical concepts directly to the base realities of trade, labor management, anxiety reduction, and the global political economy.
The transformation of profound, abstract concepts into shrines, relics, and ritual economies reveals a fundamental truth of human history and psychology. The greatest systems of thought survive only by sacrificing their initial purity on the altar of material, psychological, and financial necessity, creating wealth and memory simultaneously.